This question relates to a particular detention centre in Libya, the Qasr bin Ghashir detention camp. There have been reports from groups from various organisations regarding the treatment of repatriated detainees and whether the EU policy is problematic, especially the repatriation of migrants to such conditions.
Thanks, Deputy. You're keeping me busy today, but this is a really worrying development. The situation in Libya has deteriorated significantly in recent months, as you know, and is extremely dangerous. As the Deputy has highlighted, as part of the ongoing conflict, an attack affecting migrants was reported in April at Qasr bin Ghashir. There are conflicting reports on what actually happened, but the UNHCR has stated that 12 people were physically attacked and required hospital treatment. The following day, the UNHCR and IOM, with the support of the Libyan authorities and the UN mission in Libya, evacuated 325 refugees from Qasr bin Ghashir to a safer location. The EU provides support to the work of the UNHCR and IOM in Libya and to their efforts to relocate migrants and refugees to safer places, both inside Libya and where voluntary return is possible to their countries of origin. The EU believes that detention centres are not a suitable place for migrants in Libya. However, political fragmentation and the fragile security situation in Libya limit the capacity of the international community to access all areas where migrants are currently located or to influence the situation on the ground. Ensuring an end to human rights abuses will require restoration of political stability and a fully functioning government. I continue to be deeply troubled by the human rights abuses against civilians, including migrants and refugees in Libya, and in particular by persistent reports of abuse in detention centres. The ongoing fighting around Tripoli is endangering thousands of civilians and putting already very vulnerable migrants and refugees further at risk. I agree with the UNHCR's assessment that Libya is not a safe third country for refugees and migrants, and that those rescued at sea should not be returned to Libya. It is not EU policy to send people back to Libya, but rather to disrupt the business model of smugglers and traffickers so as to prevent further loss of life in the Mediterranean.
The final paragraph will be included in the official report.
Finally, can I just say, because I think it's important, all EU member states have called on parties in the conflict
It'll be in the report anyway, Tánaiste,
to immediately implement a ceasefire. I'll come back to you on your next question.
That people who are rescued in the Mediterranean are being returned to these detention centres. And I've had other questions and discussion on this before, because I've met particularly MSF staff, nurses and doctors, who have been working on both the ships and who have been working in the detention centres. And the centres, you know, there's just appalling abuse of human rights, starvation, there's malnutrition, there's rape and there's violence and there's a lack of care. And then to add to that now, some of these detention centres are caught in the fighting between the self-styled Libyan National Army, led by General Haftar, and the UN-backed government in Libya. So it's adding to the misery that's already there, that they're now caught in the crossfire there. And we know about that particular case, which is in that detention centre, about 25 kilometres from Tripoli. And there have been conflicting reports, so I'd just like to stress the importance of getting accurate information, and then when we have the information, that there is action on that particular information. There was also a report that some of the refugees were being forced into assisting the fighters. I mean, all of these things that are going on are just appalling, and it's immoral, it's unethical, and it's downright cruel to consign people, so-called rescued from the Mediterranean, and you're putting them into a worse fate by sending them to these. And it's tens of millions of euro that are going in to support the Coast Guard in Libya for the refugees to go back to those detention centres.
First of all, Deputy, it's not EU policy to send refugees and migrants that have been rescued in the Mediterranean back to Libya. We don't regard that as safe. There was certainly an understanding with the Libyan Coast Guard before the recent violence broke out in Tripoli. But certainly since that violence broke out, the functioning of Libya as a state and the ability of them to protect migrants in camps has been fundamentally undermined. And the case that you referred to earlier and that I responded to is a pretty graphic example of that. And the concerns around physical abuse, sexual abuse of both adults and children in many of those camps is appalling. I have to say I don't believe that the EU's response in relation to what is now left of Operation Sophia is good enough, I have to say. The idea that we no longer have EU boats or ships in the Mediterranean focused on search and rescue, in my view, is not good enough. But we couldn't get agreement in relation to the continuation of Operation Sophia as was, mainly because we couldn't get agreement around disembarkation and the sharing of the burden in relation to refugees and asylum seekers. We have, on a number of occasions in recent months, quietly accepted small numbers of refugees from both Malta and Italy.
Too reasonable.
In relation to rescues. But this needs a more fundamental solution from the EU.
Listen, could we just clarify this? We're going a minute over and others are waiting. Final question, Deputy O'Sullivan.
I just want to draw your attention to the fact that in the first week in June, there was a submission to the International Criminal Court relating to the current situation, and it's calling for the EU and Member States to be prosecuted for the deaths of thousands of refugees and migrants who have drowned in the Mediterranean while trying to flee Libya. So that began in the first week in June. So it's very difficult to reconcile what you're saying with the reality. The reality is that millions went into the so-called rescue training of the Coast Guards. That training left an awful lot to be desired, because what they were doing was they were taking people from the sea, bringing them to these detention centres. I think it was in 2018, 2,500 people drowned at sea. Now, perhaps that was the better fate, rather than ending up in these detention centres where you were going to have a living death while you were in those particular detention centres. So, I mean, it's against international law that you would return refugees to a centre that's in the middle of a war. But that's what's happening in Libya, and that's what's continuing to happen.
I get 1 minute.
I think I've said it in both responses. It is not EU policy to return migrants and refugees that are rescued in the Mediterranean back to Libya now. It's not EU policy. So please stop saying that it is. We don't control the Libyan Coast Guard. The Libyan government is, for obvious reasons, under some threat now of violence around Tripoli. And so the solutions that were potentially there in the past aren't appropriate now because of the level of violence and the exposure and vulnerability of refugees and the inability of the international community, whether it's the UN or whether it's the IOM, to be able to support them. We know that, which is why the main focus has to be to end the violence in and around Tripoli, so that we can actually get at supporting what are very vulnerable communities in many of these camps.
Deputy